Now, although this may look a lot like PJ or Subang Jaya to any of you, I'm actually all the way out in Sabah, and although this might look like any other X70, if you look very closely, you'll find that this is the new 2025 refreshed model, which in addition to having new wheels, a new front end, a slightly reprofiled rear bumper, and some tweaks on the inside, Proton says that the value of this car lies in the things you cannot see. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our preview drive of the 2025 Proton X70 here in beautiful, gorgeous, sunny Sabah. Now, if you've been following our channel over the last few years, you will know that there is a certain quality to our videos and a certain format to them, but we have to ditch that format today because I'm out here filming alone. A lot of that work and a lot of that quality comes as a result of our videographer, who is currently not with me, which is why I have to shoot this like this. So bear with me. So the new Proton X70 has a few refinements about it, and a lot of it has to do with the aesthetics. So in order to mark this out over the previous generation model, which was introduced in 2022, this heavy facelift sees a very different front end. So we now get a reimagination of the ethereal bow, now with chrome pins in it, bringing this in line with the X90 as well as the S70. We now get slightly reprofiled headlights, which now come with the LED daytime running lights with scrolling indicators all built into the same unit. We still get some fog lights down here. We also get air breathers down the side in order to improve aerodynamics. We also see the deletion of the radar down there because now with the upgraded ADAS system, it only relies on the cameras up on the top of the windscreen. Down the side, while we still have a very familiar profile, we now have 19-inch alloy wheels here, still wrapped in the same Continental Ultra Contact UC6 tires. The bonnet now sees the inclusion of these power bulges, something that we saw before from Mercedes-Benz, and it's now here even though there have been zero changes under the bonnet. We still get the same TGDI badge there, all very familiar, and down the back we get newly reprofiled rear bumpers, which now make this car a little bit shorter, but unfortunately we also get the same taillight design that we saw previously from the X70. This is, I think, the biggest disappointment for me because I feel that visually they could have differentiated the 2025 model year car by changing the internal designs of this. Now, what's also changed is the power boot, which is now available across all variants, but the practicality remains the same, which means that in here you still have a pretty decent amount of space, good enough for a family of 5. And of course, you can fold the rear seats 60-40 for added practicality. You still have a tonneau cover, which is always nice to see. But that brings me on to some of the biggest changes for this car, and that comes from the interior. Because where the top spec models used to come with a brown leather upholstery, we now get this stone grey material. So this is still Napa leather and it's still nice and soft and it's still got nice contrast stitching, but this is now done in a stone grey, and that extends all the way into the door cards where you get a little bit of decorative trim and decorative stitching in order to mark the car out. We still get the same Boss switches in the front passenger seat. We also get panoramic sunroof in the flagship X models, and so this all remains very familiar. So this has now been changed, but there's also been changes over here. So now this is a floating style head unit, very similar to what we saw from the X90 and S70, which also runs the very latest IHU systems from Proton. Now, I will get onto this a little bit later because there is still a lot to discuss, but in addition to there being the very latest interfaces, also comes with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which will come via an over-the-air update in due course. There is also ambient lighting on the dash front, which has been reprofiled in order to better fit and integrate this new head unit. But up front, you will also find a slightly altered digital instrument cluster. So while the overall shape of it remains the same and the overall size remains the same, the graphics are now again more in line with what we saw from the X90 as well as the S70, which means that the car is now able to display what it can see via the world around it, which means that you have better trust within the ADAS system for it to perceive the world. And overall, this is quite positive. As you can see here now, we have the ambient lighting going off and changing colors based on the different modes. We still have the dual zone climate control system down here via these nice physical knobs. It's always nice to see. But this head unit not only looks good, but it's also incredibly snappy. As you can see, the responses on this are excellent, which means that this is a system that you can live with quite easily. And I appreciate the fact that even though you can adjust things through this system, like the volume, for example, you still retain the physical controls for the air conditioning. See, you can adjust it here, but you still have the buttons down here. Now, some people say that this is a lazy integration of the system, as if they've added this on top of the dash, but I disagree, because I think that the tactility of having buttons here really does make a huge difference. The other change, of course, comes from the steering wheel itself. If you look closely, this is actually the same steering wheel that we saw from the X50 and the S70, which means that the overall design is a little bit different. These buttons operate a bit differently, which is certainly nice to see, because the way these buttons manipulate that instrument cluster used to be really annoying on the pre-facelift model. So this is a huge change, and one that I certainly welcome. Unfortunately, the seat that I'm sat in still doesn't have angle adjustment, only has height adjustment, which means that it is still surprisingly difficult to get a comfortable driving position. Now, that aside, there's actually a lot more to discuss about this X70, because in addition to all the things that you can see, there have been a ton of refinements to things that you cannot. And these are the things that Proton says makes the biggest difference when it comes to the 2025 Proton X70. And so for that, let's get back on the road. Also because I'm late for an event. Now, the thing about the X70, or at least what Proton is saying most about the X70, is about all the changes that we can't see. So the engine, for example, hasn't really seen any changes. So it still produces 177 PS, 255 Newton meters of torque, and that's still paired to a 7-speed dual clutch automatic. Again, the same setup that we saw first introduced in 2022. So there is certainly no surprises there. In terms of the suspension setup, Proton also says there hasn't really been much change in terms of ride and handling, so that isn't really a big deal either. Rather, the refinements that have been made to this car are into what I'd refer to as quality of life upgrades, things that would continue to make this car appealing on the broader market, particularly given the fact that over the last few years we've seen a lot more entrance into the C-segment SUV space, and so the X70 is looking a little bit tired. Now, one of the biggest changes come in terms of the active safety. So the X70 did sort of blaze a trail for Proton in terms of offering things like autonomous emergency braking and adaptive cruise control and blind spot monitoring and stuff like that. But in the time that it's taken to get to this update, we've also seen cars pick up things like traffic jam assist and stuff like that, which the X70 never offered. Now it does. So as I mentioned earlier, we've lost the radar on the bumper, and now it runs a camera-based system, the same thing that we've seen from the X50 first, followed by the X90 as well as the S70. Now, the way this system works remains a little bit rough around the edges compared to what we've seen from certain other car makers, but it is still reliable enough. Now, it's reliable enough in traffic jams, it's reliable enough on the motorway, and it is dependable enough to keep you in lane and generally keep you out of harm's way, so that's certainly a good thing. The other big update comes in terms of NVH refinement. So Proton says that they have reworked a significant number of parts within the new X70 in order to improve the refinement that we already thought was very impressive from this car. Now, things like road noise were never really too big of an issue because the tires did a very good job of suppressing a lot of that noise. But wind noise has also been addressed in order to allow this car to remain comfortably quiet at speeds north of the motorway limit. On top of that, although Proton says there hasn't really been any changes to the suspension, we do feel that this car does seem slightly more confident than before, but just a little bit. And even if there haven't been any changes, we can report that this car is still fairly confident to be driven at higher speeds. It doesn't have the same sort of floaty feeling that you get from, for example, certain Chinese car makers. Although it doesn't have the same sort of polish that you get from something like, say, Volkswagen Tiguan or Honda CR-V, it's still pretty good, which means that this is a car that most Malaysians would be generally quite agreeable with. But I think that on the whole, we have to understand where the X70 started, and so to then better understand where this particular facelift is going. So when the X70 first arrived on the market, it was quite clear that this was a car that was primarily geared at Malaysian families, as well as slightly better to do older individuals looking for a vehicle that they could just pot about in and feel comfortable and safe in. And I think that the upgraded X70 just builds upon that. I touched on this when we first previewed the X70 back at the Proton test track some weeks ago, and that sentiment remains very similar now. Because having driven this car several hundred kilometers through Sabah, and bear in mind I'm not very familiar with Kota Kinabalu, I haven't been here for a long time, despite all of the uncertainties that exist around here and all of that anxiety, potentially anxiety-inducing situations, at no point have I felt insecure driving this car, which means that the X70 continues to do its job of being able to provide that sense of security from people who want large SUVs like this, and so that's certainly a very positive affair. Additionally, I'm not sure if it can be heard over the mic, but this car still remains so comfortable that even while I jabber on and explain this to you, my colleague can fall asleep in the back seat, and he is snoring. Now, going back to it, there are still some sore points with this car. Firstly, the dual clutch automatic gearbox is still not the sharpest tool in the shed. I would have preferred something a little bit more reactive, given the fact that this is a dual clutch automatic. We would have wanted something that is a bit sprightlier, something that doesn't quite hesitate when it's put into action. And rather more annoyingly, the fuel economy in this car remains quite ghastly. So I have complained about the fuel economy in the X70 in the past, and I've labelled it one of its major issues. And although Proton says that this car is now 7% or 4% more efficient than before, which is largely down to a reworked final gear ratio for the 7-speed dual clutch automatic, it's still not great. But ultimately, the X70 still has a significant price advantage compared to competitors from Korea as well as Japan, which means that you claw back some of those savings from the purchase price, which you then have to put towards fuel. Now, that aside, from this quick drive here in Sabah, I can tell you with certainty that the X70 remains a very confident and very easy vehicle for us to recommend. This is still a great car for people just looking for a comfortable C-segment SUV, for a car to just do daily chores in. It remains smooth and confident and well built and very refined. And in fact, from a personal perspective, I can see myself doing many hours worth of journeys in a car like this in perfect comfort. I'm not really wanting for anything. And to address certain questions that were raised in the comments from the preview drive, we can say that firstly, the audio system in this car has been improved, so it no longer sounds like a gramophone through a tube. And I can say that the steering wheel still feels very natural, which again cannot be said of certain Chinese competitors within this space. So overall, the X70 remains a car that we would recommend very highly, and it's certainly something worth considering if you're on the market within the C segment. But ultimately, there is still a lot more for me to explore in this car, which we will do when we finally get it out on the test. But until then, that concludes our preview drive of the new Proton X70 here in Sabah. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and if you do fall asleep in the car, try not to lean forward because it'll hurt your neck. Catch you in the next one.